Now, you've probably seen forum nerds or people on the internet say that you need X analog EQ or Y analog compressor to make your music sound professional. Why this has become a thing, I don't know. The question we have to ask though is, are these plugins and devices really worth it in electronic dance music production? Do they have a place? But today I want to show you there is a way if you're using it right and not the wrong way. So I'm going to take a lesson from my producer launchpad program. This is normally exclusive only for those people I work with one-on-one, and share it with you today because this information needs to be out there, to be honest. And I don't want people ruining their mixes. So if you do want to work with me one-on-one, I will leave a link for more information on the program. I would love to help you bring your music up to professional quality, but let's get into today's video.
So we're going to be talking about the analog type plugins. This ranges from analog saturators to analog EQ to analog compressors and so on and so forth. So I'm going to do this all in one video just to group the purpose of these tools into one thing, so you're not understanding, analog to be this universally better domain of plugin, because it's really not. As we're about to find out, it has a very particular use case. It injects color into your sound, which is sometimes what you want and sometimes is not what you want. Great, so let's start with analog saturation, since I think that tends to be heralded as the holy grail of analog type effects. Now, analog saturation functions as a normal saturator, like we've already covered. However, it has a different kind of unpredictable way of working and leaves a sonic imprint on the track. I'm going to add Soundtoys Decapitator, which is an analog saturator, to our channel here, and let's listen to what it does. The first thing you need to do when working with analog type plugins is you normally have to work at a slightly lower volume, because these plugins are based off analog units, which worked normally at -6 dB peak as a maximum, which I think is about -18 on a VU meter. For those of you who are familiar with what a VU meter is, it's kind of similar to what this attitude meter looks like here on Decapitator. Regardless of that, just check your input volume before the plugin and see where you're hitting. So we're hitting about -4, -3. That should be fine. It's probably a little on the hotter side, but it's nothing we can't deal with, right? If you're going over 0 dB before you're using any analog type plugins, you might want to grab again a utility in your DAW and just bring down the gain by as much to get to around -6 peak value as possible. But in this case, we should be fine. But let's turn off the plugin, listen to the drums, and then let's turn it on and hear how by default the sound is already changed. So we can already hear that the signal is being affected by what's going on in Decapitator without me having to touch a knob. This is the behavior of analog type plugins. They are going to do this. So you want to be really careful that you know what you're doing and how it's affecting potentially your perceived mix and a number of other things. Let's bring up Decapitator's drive here to really hear the effect of what's going on. Turn it off. So the low mids are a lot weightier with this on, right? It's adding a bit of crunch as well to the mid range. Kind of feels like it's gluing with super glue all the elements together, if that makes sense. And each of these modes down the bottom here, again, I'm just using Decapitator here as an example, are going to do something different. This is, a demonstration of maybe how different saturation plugins will affect your signal in different ways. For example, let's switch it onto E mode here and hear how the sound now is even more different. Way more brightness, right? It's like almost like there's an EQ going on there. Let's go to N, T, now again, if you're finding by default there's too much distortion, this is where again you should bring down the volume before with the utility. So you can see here that all of these have different sonic characteristics, not just in terms of tone, but also in terms of the distortion type, in terms of which frequencies are emphasized over other ones, how much the drive has to be pushed for it to sound good, etc. So every analog saturator is different. You want to use this just to add coloration either on an individual hit or maybe on a bus of elements. I'm very wary to recommend using this on certain buses or even your master though, because it can drastically alter it in terms of the coloration response. So be very careful. One thing analog saturation is good for is if your mix is sounding overly digital and pristine, it can be nice to take the edge off a little bit and add a bit of dirt into the mix. For example, I could go here to the master and see how it's going to sound. Again, I'm very careful to use it on the master, but let's see how this sounds on the A mode, which is probably the most subtle of these 5, with a tiny bit of drive. Turn off the solo on the drums. Bring down the utility before and after to kind of make sure we're operating in that correct volume range, right? +5 afterwards. Group those together and turn it on and off. It does add grit to the mix, but it's kind of nice. Again, you can go even less on the input and output if you really wanted to. But again, I'm not a huge fan of the too crazy coloration it's adding. So if I was to use something like this, I'd be, going to the kick drum, for example, finding the right settings and just using on a one-off element. Right? In this case though, I don't really think that's needed. The second category here is analog EQs. Now, analog EQs may or may not add saturation depending on the plugin, but what they do is have a very preset ways of working in terms of the types of bands you can use. To visually explain this, I'm going to use Ableton's channel EQ on my drums bus here. And what I'm going to do, actually, I'll use this on my master instead, because it's probably the easiest to hear it on all frequencies. And I'm going to adjust the low, mid, and high band, and you'll see that there's not really a lot of flexibility I have with what it does. Let's adjust the highs. Right, so I'm pretty stuck with the curves that it's adding. All I can do is do the lows and highs, boost or cut, mid-range with a singular frequency control, and then a general high pass. This is basically how an analog EQ works. You can't change a lot of the settings, and the curves just are kind of designed to sound musical. You can move them and don't have to worry about the specific frequencies that they're controlling. It just is programmed to sound good. Right, so let's delete that and use an actual analog EQ plugin. For example, I'm going to go to waves here and try and find, maybe we'll use the Poigtech stereo here. The EQ P1A sometimes is good, or the EQ5 is sometimes good, but I like the 1A is a pretty classic one, and for example, I can select the frequency of the high end here, whether it's 5, 10, or 20 kilohertz. I can either boost it or attenuate it, right? So let's boost it. Change the frequency. It doesn't allow me to get too technical. It just allows me to force, to add the right amount of frequencies by ear, which is really good for analog EQ. Now, again, these plugins can add a bit of saturation by default. So even if we were to do a quick null test, I'm going to group this here, have one with the Poigtech on by default with no actual adjustments, and with a utility on it with the phase flipped. Let's see if we can hear any effects. Whereas with the effects, with the EQ off, you can hear nothing, which means that the EQP1A is, for example, adding some difference to the signal by default, even with no changes, right? Which is pretty cool. So these plugins can add a bit of saturation, but really you're using them for these boosts and cuts. And just use them to make your mix sound more musical. I tend to use these only exclusively on buses and on mastering. Again, if you're using on mastering, be careful the amount of saturation it's being added isn't too much. In this case, it doesn't sound like a lot, even though the null tests sounded quite different. So that's very important to consider. Just play around with the individual plugins, see what sounds good. Another really good suggestion I have is the Marg EQ. I really like this one, especially for adding top end to my mix. The airband sounds really nice. Let's bring that up. There's obviously such thing as too much, but you can kind of just hear how these sound really musical and lovely without you having to worry about, again, technical controls, right? Just go by ear. Right? And that's pretty much it for EQ. The last category here is compressors. Now, analog compressors are good on, like as the same with analog saturators and analog EQs, on kind of organic sounds. For example, I might use a analog compressor on this vocal, maybe even instead of the original compressor I used. An example would be something like the CLA2A, which is a classic kind of compressor which you can use on vocals. Normally these analog compressors are very simple. You just kind of have a few knobs, input gain and peak reduction in this case, and kind of just get them sounding even, right? Let's play around with these and see what happens. I'm going to turn off my echo. By the way, this gain is output gain, not input. So if you want to control the amount of compression, it's basically just peak reduction. It just kind of adds a bit of life and movement to the vocal, right? And loudness. Just sounds very transparent, but also very silky. And each, again, analog compressor is going to have a different kind of behavior with how it compresses the sound. For example, if I swapped this over to like a 3A and did kind of a similar set of effects. Even the gain reduction meter is behaving differently. Sounds a bit beefier to me. Whereas the 2A sounds a little bit more kind of creamy. Anyway, that's just a quick little test there. Again, you can use these on any instruments. I could use the 3A on my keys here. Just to warm up the sound a bit, right? Sounds really nice. Bring down the gain. Just tickle the sound a bit to add a bit of character. Again, they sound a little more unpredictable in comparison to a digital compressor, which does what you tell it to do. The purpose of this is not to be super precise, but just to add coloration, add warmth, add musicality back into a mix that otherwise might not have it. And that goes for all of the analog style plugins, saturation, EQ, compressors, right? One last quick EQ one that I like to use as well is, it's kind of a distortion and EQ in one, is Radiator. It's kind of a bass treble only EQ. For example, if we use it on the keys here. It's probably not even a good one to use on that. Probably I'd use it on the drums, if anything. You can control whether it's a clean or a noisy signal. I like to keep it on line to keep it pretty clean sounding. And then you can just play around with the bass and treble, but also use the input output to add saturation. Right? Without it, with it. dry wet it a bit. That actually adds a really interesting amount of life to the drums that I really like. So you can see some plugins kind of function as a saturator, EQ all in one, right? So to recap, you've got 3 types of general analog type plugins. You've got EQs, compressors, and saturators. Each of them are designed to add musicality, warmth back in the mix, but at the same time, you have to be careful because they do not behave in the way you would expect them to. So use them sparingly, use them deliberately, generally again on buses and on masters. That is it for this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.
I hope you now feel equipped to use these plugins in the right way. And again, if you want not only to work with me one-on-one, but get discounts on some of the plugins I use in this video, apply to work with me one-on-one in the Producer Launchpad. I'll help you over the next 3 months, 12 weeks, however you want to look at it. Bring your music up from where you're currently at, which I'm going to assume is stuck and you're not 100% happy with it, to a point where you're able to put together a track that is release ready, whether you want to send it out to self-release or send it out to labels, and so you can finally feel happy with the music that's coming out of your door. So click the link below for more information and apply to work with me. But until next time, happy producing.